Happy Easter, everyone. Welcome to Church and State with Spencer Sanderson. I'm your host, Spencer Sanderson, and whenever, wherever, and however you're listening, it is an honor to be a part of your day. First off, I know it's been a while since I uploaded an episode, and I will say that this semester has been insanely busy. I'm getting through it. I'm doing good. Don't have too much longer till I graduate, but it has been quite a busy semester. But I wanted to make it a point to make an episode for this Easter so I could get that out for y'all. So what we're going to do in this episode is go over the Easter story from around the time that Jesus begins to predict his death all the way to his trial, his crucifixion, his burial, and his resurrection. And it's going to be kind of in more of a little bit of a narrative format. I'm just telling the story here. I want to cover as much of the story as I can because I know some people, this might be the first time they're hearing about the Easter story. So I want to explore a few details, but I want really the big picture to be driven home about what Jesus did during his final days on earth, the lessons that he imparted to his disciples, and just the really important details around his actual arrest and trial and how all that occurred and what happened even in the very final moments of Jesus being alive. He uttered some extremely important words as his last dying words on the cross before being buried. So we're going to begin. We're going to kind of hopscotch around the gospel a little bit. We're going to start with Matthew. We're going to pull some stuff from Mark, some stuff from John, some stuff from Luke, because if you know the Gospels, you know that all four Gospels, they tell the same story, but in different ways, and they include different things, different wordings of some things. But we're going to begin in Matthew in chapter 16, and this is when Jesus for the first time predicts his eventual death. We start in verse 21 where Jesus predicts that he is going to die and he will die most brutally, but he will rise again 3 days later. And Peter jumps in and he's like, no, this cannot be allowed to happen. But Jesus knows that this is the will of his Father. This is what has been prophesied in the Old Testament, that the Son of Man will have to die to save everyone from their sins. But Peter is just, he's been rolling with Jesus for a while. He's become very close with him. So he says, I'm not going to let this happen. And Jesus says something very interesting. He looks at Peter and says, "Get back, Satan," because Peter is essentially saying in this moment that the will of God that has been prophesied will not come to fruition and will not happen. So Jesus is like, don't you dare entertain that thought. This has to happen so that I can save humanity from their sins and be the way, the truth, and the life. And then we jump next to chapter 17, where Jesus takes his disciples up onto a mountaintop and he actually transfigures in front of them, and he is joined by Elijah and Moses that appear on either side of him. And it's written that Jesus in this moment shone like the sun. He was a blinding bright light, and Moses and Elijah accompanied him. And during this time, a voice boomed down from the heavens, and it was the voice of God that says, "This is my son, who I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." Later on, Jesus predicts his death a second time, and this is the time where he specifies that, yes, I am going to die. This is what's going to happen. But on that third day, I will rise again, and I will no longer be of this earth, but I will rise on the third day to join my Father in heaven. And then over the next few days, Jesus continues to go around preaching like he usually does. He gives a lot of parables, a lot of lessons. He continues to perform miracles, because even though he knows he's going to die soon, the work is not done yet. The work really is never finished, but Jesus' task right here is not done. He is still to go around to proclaim the good news, to spread the word, to heal people of their sickness, cast out demons. So he continues to do that. Now, when we get to Matthew 24, Jesus actually gives somewhat of a glimpse into what the end times and the final days are going to look like. And he speaks these words. He says, quote, "Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes. Many false prophets are going to appear and deceive many people, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. And it is a glimpse into chaos, war, bloodshed, deception, fear. All that is going to happen in the end times when everything comes to a close. But take heart that last line, the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. The one who gives their heart to God, the one who asks Jesus into their life to be saved, they will be saved when the end times come. And then Jesus reaffirms, because it's funny that we see a lot of this today, where even fellow Christians will try and predict, when the rapture is going to happen. I'm sure I've seen personally like 3 different times that since I was born, 3 different times where a big group of people online are like, "Oh, the rapture's happening. It's this Friday. It's this Friday. The world is ending this Friday. Give it up, guys. Give it up. Just drop what you're doing. World's going to end." And Jesus, he kind of laughs at that, and he says, "The day and the hour will be unknown to everyone." We don't know when the world is going to end. We don't know when the end times are. So anyone who tries to claim like they know exactly when the rapture is going to happen, those are one of the false prophets that Jesus warns about. Now, Matthew chapter 26 has a insane amount of stuff going on. There is so very much to cover here. But before we get to Matthew 26, let's just take a moment. I know I hadn't gone through a whole lot just yet, but let's just recap for a bit. Jesus is beginning to predict his death. He tells his disciples to get ready. He gives them some clues about what the end times are going to look like, the wars, the famine, the false prophets that will appear, about the obscurity of when the actual date is that the end times will occur. And during all this, he's still going around and doing his duty of evangelizing and healing people, driving out demons, helping the needy, giving strength to the poor. And he is out doing that. So now, Matthew 26, this is when the plot to finally arrest and capture Jesus is put into motion. So the chief priest, or the priest, I'm pretty sure it's plural. There's many chief priests, but they and the elders gather, and they decide that they're going to secretly arrest Jesus. But there's a problem, is that in 2 days from now, 2 days from the time they're meeting, is the festival of Passover. And they're like, well, we don't want to make a big scene and try and arrest him at the Passover, because that might cause a riot. That would kind of put a damper on the whole festival. So if we're going to move on him during the Passover, it needs to be done discreetly. Meanwhile, across the way in Bethany, Jesus is anointed with a extremely expensive jar of oil. I'm not sure exactly. It didn't say in the Bible how much it cost, but it was a very luxury oil that this woman had that was, he was anointed by. And one of the disciples had asked, like, well, it's pretty expensive. What's going on? And Jesus is like, she's preparing my body for burial. He's trying to drive it home to these disciples, who some of them still have doubt in their minds, like, okay, Jesus is not about to die, is he? Like, surely there's a way that this can be avoided. He's trying to drive it into them that, like, this is going to happen. I want to prepare you. You need to be prepared. This is what is to come in the next few days. While these two things are happening, so the elders are convening, Jesus is being anointed, Judas, Mr. Judas Iscariot, he goes to the chief priest and he asks them, he's like, hey, if I betray Jesus, let's say hypothetically, I lead you to him and it leads to his capture, what would you be willing to give me? Let's make a deal. I'm interested. And they agree to hand over to Judas 30 pieces of silver. So he's like, you know what? Seems fair. They shake on it. And Judas gets that 30 pieces of silver to betray Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Then Jesus gathers all of his disciples to celebrate the Passover festival, and this is what is commonly known as the Last Supper. He gets them all together, and this is the first time communion was given, with the disciples and with Jesus explaining, this bread, this is my body, and this wine, this is my blood that was shed for you. My body is broken for you, and my blood is shed for you. In a lot of denominations, it's communion. I know in Catholicism, they refer to it as the Eucharist, but this is where that comes from. This is where the act of communion comes from. It was the Last Supper before Jesus' death. But Jesus tells the table, while he's got them all there, he says, by the way, one of y'all is going to betray me. And they start kind of murmuring amongst each other, like, well, surely it's not me. Well, it can't be me. I wouldn't betray you. I would never do a thing like that. And then Jesus says, the person who dips his bread into this bowl with me will betray me. And that ended up applying to Judas, who, had already, Judas hadn't handed Jesus over yet, but in effect, Judas had already betrayed Jesus because he had gone to the chief priests and accepted the silver. So the plan is in motion. And then Jesus says next that this very night, while they're around the table, this same night, his disciples will be scattered. And he looks to Peter and says, you, Peter, specifically, you are going to deny me 3 times before the rooster crows. And Peter's like, oh, absolutely not. Like, what? I'm not going to do that. Like, I love you, Jesus, rabbi, teacher. That's what they referred to him as. He was a mentor to them all. He's like, I would never do such a thing. We'll see how that ends up. But later, Jesus goes to the Garden of Gethsemane to pray. And right now, the Garden of Gethsemane, so sometimes a little bit of a mouthful, it is still a garden in Jerusalem, and it's actually able to be toured. I know a couple people from my church have been to the Holy Land before and walked around all those sites. I think it'd be pretty neat to see those things in person. But the Garden of Gethsemane, it's still there today. So if any of y'all have been to the Holy Land and seen it, I'm sure that was a wonderful experience. But it's still there. And after the supper, he went there to pray, and during this prayer, he prays to God 3 times. And he says something specific about, will you take this cup from me, or will I have to drink from this cup? And the cup that Jesus is talking about having to drink from, or, being able to surrender to God, is the sins of humanity. And eventually, Jesus accepts the fact, which he knew what was going to happen, but he was praying to God, and he knows in his heart that he must drink from that cup and take on the sins of every single person who has ever lived and die for them. So this is a very somber moment. It's a very nice, tranquil garden. Jesus is by himself because he brought some disciples with him, but he told them to kind of stand guard while he goes over here and meditate. By the way, while he's doing all that, the disciples twice, I think, repeatedly fall asleep. So not very good watchmen, but Jesus is meditating, and this is the moment where it's very somber. He's like, this is what's going to happen. In mere moments, these things will start being set into motion. They've already been set into motion by Jesus predicting his death and Judas's betrayal. But this right here, this is where it all begins to really start rolling. So Jesus, he accepts that he will have to drink from that cup, and he says to God, let your will be done. So puts, completely places everything in God's hands. He knows what is to happen, and he's going to obey his Father. And just then, Judas arrives, and he is with a very, very large crowd. They have clubs, swords. For that time, they are armed to the teeth with weaponry. And Judas, he talks to one of the guards up front. He says, hey, the person that I kiss, that's the one you need to nab. That's the person you need to capture. So then he kind of fakes excitement a little bit and runs towards Jesus and goes, oh, Rabbi, Rabbi, and throws his arms around him. And then he gives Jesus a kiss. And immediately the crowd advances and they move to arrest Jesus. But what's very chilling to me during this moment is when Judas gives Jesus a kiss, and then he backs up. And Jesus notices the crowd beginning to advance. He looks Judas dead in the eye and says, do what you came for, friend. It's just, I know what you're up to. You're here. Just get it over with. Do what you came for. And they move to arrest Jesus. And during this, Peter is filled with so much anger, because remember, towards the beginning, Peter was the one that was like, I'm not going to let this happen. I'm not going to let you die. Peter takes out his sword and slices off the ear of one of the servants of the high priest. And Jesus immediately rebukes this and turns to him and says, "Put your sword down. Stop this nonsense. Put your sword down." He says, "All who draw the sword will die by the sword. Surely you know that if I wanted to, I could call upon my Father and he would dispatch legions of angels to protect me. However, the scripture must be fulfilled." Basically telling Peter, like, look, put the sword down. If you know I'm fully capable of protecting myself. If I wanted to, I snap my fingers and God sends his angels down. But this has to happen. So Peter, lay down your weapons. This has to happen for the good of humanity. These events must unfold. And then Jesus turns to the crowd and he's like, he's quoted as saying, the way you've all come to arrest me in this mob, you act like I've been leading a rebellion. You treat me like some sort of violent insurrectionist when every day all I did was teach in the temple courts, and not once did you decide to arrest me there. But then he ends that talk with the same thing he said to Peter. However, the scripture must be fulfilled. The word of the prophets must be fulfilled. So we're still in chapter 26, by the way, because remember I told you Matthew 26 has a lot going on in it. But now Jesus is taken before the Sanhedrin, which is essentially the Israeli Supreme Court at that time. It's the highest court of the Jews. And it's written that Peter kind of followed at a distance because this whole crowd is taking Jesus to the court. Peter followed at a distance and kind of snuck in to sit with some of the guards so he could listen in on the trial. But the funny part is, or not funny, the interesting part is the chief priests, once they begin the trial, not only could they not find any real evidence against God, they were unable to fabricate any evidence towards him because Jesus technically, I said fabricate evidence against God. I meant against Jesus. They weren't able to bring any evidence towards Jesus, whether real or fake. However, they did get several people to come forward and falsely testify, with one of them quoted as saying, "I heard this man," talking about Jesus, "I heard this man say that he has the ability to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days." And this, seems like a passing comment, like, yeah, Jesus is he's capable of many, many miracles. He could destroy that building and rebuild it in 3 days. But think about what's going on here. That's Jesus's body being destroyed and rebuilt in 3 days, rising in 3 days and going up to heaven to be with his Father. That's what Jesus was talking about when he said, "I can destroy this temple and rebuild it in 3 days." The temple of God is the body of Jesus. So that is one of the witnesses that came forward, tried to say that, and the priest then asked Jesus, "All right, you got anything to say about that? Like, do you want to respond? This accusation's been made. Do you want to respond to that?" And Jesus remained silent, which perplexes everyone. It's like, I mean, you don't want to say anything? Are you sure? And then the high priest, he kind of swears Jesus in and puts him under an official oath, and he says, "You are on oath under God. Do you declare that you are the Messiah, the Son of God?" And Jesus is like, "You said it, not me." he's like, you have said so. And he says, "From now on, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One." And this reminds me of, I grew up partially in a Methodist church, and we recite the Apostles' Creed at the start of every sermon. And one of the lines in the Apostles' Creed that said, "He sitteth at the right hand of God the Father Almighty." So he's telling them, from now on, you're not going to see me here on this earth. I'm going to be sitting at the right hand of my Father. So essentially, like I said, do what you want, do what you may. The scripture has to be fulfilled. And the high priest, he is so mad by this because Jesus is not outwardly confessing to anything, but Jesus is just saying, "Look, this is going to happen. You've made it so. Do what you want." And the priest tears his clothes and he says, "This man right here is a blasphemer. Jesus, I accuse you of blasphemy." And the rest of the priests sitting there come to the conclusion, the agreement, that Jesus is now deserving of death. Blasphemy was taken extremely seriously. And they saw Jesus as essentially a false prophet who was claiming to be the Son of God and blaspheming God in the process. That was the perspective of the Jews at the time. So they're like, yes, he is deserving He's deserving of death. So after the trial is dismissed and Jesus is being taken away, Peter is confronted 3 times by different people, and they ask him like, "Hey, that man over there, you know him, don't you?" He's like, "No, I don't." And then one of them's like, "Well, I saw you walking with him one day. You know him, don't you?" He's like, "Mm-mm, I don't know. Jesus doesn't ring a bell. Never heard of him." And he's asked a third time. He denies it a third time. And what do you know? Like clockwork, the rooster crows, and Peter begins to weep bitterly. Not only because what Jesus said about, hey, you're going to deny me 3 times, and that came true, but he's fully accepting now that everything Jesus said is going to come true. There's not going to be some last minute thing where Jesus gets down from the cross and decides to save himself. Peter knows that he has just denied knowing his teacher. He has forsaken his teacher, and he is surely about to have to watch his teacher be killed. So Jesus is handed over to the governor, who at the time is Pontius Pilate. And at this point, Judas is filled with just absolute remorse. He sees all this going on, and it just breaks his heart. So he goes back to the temple, and he's like, "Look, I messed up. I shouldn't have done this. I have betrayed an innocent man, and I don't want this silver anymore, so please have it." But then the chief priests kind of callously go, "Why do we care? You know, that's your problem. If he's an innocent man and you betrayed him, that's on you. You got your money. It's not our problem anymore. You know, go away." So Judas, he throws the money down and he retreats away and he hangs himself. So he hangs himself just out of the pure guilt that he feels from betraying Jesus. And the money is sitting at the temple from where he threw the bag down. And the priests pick it up and they go, "Well, we can't put blood money into the treasury because that money resulted in Jesus being handed over and his subsequent execution on the cross." They're like, this is tainted. This is blood money. We can't put it into our bank." So they took the silver and they went off and purchased a field that today is called I hope I'm pronouncing this right. It is the Al-Qadama Monastery. And Al-Qadama translates to a field of blood. So they purchase a field to serve as a burial site that still exists today. So now, Jesus is in the custody of Governor Pilate. And during the Passover, because remember, all this is taking place during the Passover. The reason they had to go ambush Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane at night was so they wouldn't make a scene and cause a fuss. So it's custom at the time for the governor to release a prisoner that was chosen by the crowd. And this is where we're going to jump to Mark real quick, because Jesus is the choice is between Jesus and another prisoner. And there's a verse in Mark that describes the other prisoner in better detail. The choice is between Jesus Christ and the other person. Y'all might know his name is Barabbas, but in Mark chapter 15, verse 7, we see that his full name is Jesus Barabbas. So this person is also named Jesus. And Jesus Barabbas was a convicted insurrectionist who had committed multiple acts of murder during his rebellion. So you see that they're definitely not equal here. You have Jesus Christ, the Son of God, whose biggest crime is offending the teachers in the synagogues and speaking about his father. Then you have this other man who was a rebel and killed a lot of people. The choice to us seems obvious as Christians, but this crowd, they were so angry at Jesus's teachings because he was painted by the high courts as a blasphemer. His trial in the Sanhedrin, they said, "You have blasphemed God." And to the crowd and to most people there, that was worthy to choose Barabbas to be released and to condemn Jesus to be executed. And they begin saying, crucify him, crucify him. And Pilate, he doesn't show a lot of emotion during this, but he gets up and ceremonially he washes his hands into a bowl in front of the crowd and holds his hands up and says, "You've made this choice. I am now free of this blood, because the crowd made the decision, not Pilate. So Pilate has absolved himself of Jesus's blood. And the people cry back out, his blood is on us and our children. So now that Barabbas is free, Jesus is now set to be executed, and he's brought into a place called the Praetorium, which is essentially that's. I couldn't tell. I did a little bit of research. It's not the governor's mansion. It's a palace for a high-ranking official. So it could have been a chief priest. It could have been Pilate's personal residence. But it is a house or a palace for a very high-ranking individual. And while he was in there, a bunch of soldiers came forward. They stripped Jesus's clothes off. They put a scarlet robe on him. They fashioned a crown out of thorns, and they mashed it down onto his head. And then they gave him a staff. So now Jesus has a crown, a staff, and very mockingly, to make fun of him, they all get down on their knees and go, "All hail, King of the Jews! All hail, King of the Jews!" And then they take the staff back out of Jesus's hand and start beating him over the head with it. So they are just making a full mockery and beating up on Jesus in the middle of this palace as kind of a final jab at him before he's put up on the cross. So then he's led to his crucifixion, and the place is called Golgotha. Again, hope I'm pronouncing that right. I'm pretty sure it's pronounced as it's written. It's pronounced Golgotha, and it translates to the place of the skull. And it's written that on the way there, a man named Simon, who was from Cyrene, helped Jesus carry his cross. So we're going to jump now from Matthew. We're now going to go over to Luke, and we're going to be in Luke chapter 23, where this story picks up. Now, Jesus was crucified alongside two other criminals. So there were three crosses total. I'm sure we're all familiar with the imagery now. In parts of the story, there were three crosses up on that hill. And while Jesus is being crucified and nailed, he prays out to God and says, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do." And that's another line in this that is just so powerful to me, where in that moment, Jesus has every reason to curse everybody around him, everybody who's crucifying him, everybody who's beating him, or just who's jeering at him and mocking him. He has every reason to want to just wish hardship and wish pain on all of them because of the pain they're putting him through. But no, he says, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do." So one of Jesus's last act was still grace and forgiveness. And you know that convicted some hearts that were there, that were mocking Jesus, and they heard him say that, like, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do." You know, some people were standing there like, "Oh, we might have made the wrong choice letting Barabbas go, or this might not be a good idea." So I said that he's buried alongside, or not buried, crucified alongside two people. And one of the criminals asks him, they said, "Aren't you the Messiah? Well, if you are, I mean, save yourself and save us while you're at it." And the other criminal chimes in and he says, "Man, do you not fear God at all?" He said, "You and I are being punished. We're being crucified justly. We're being justly punished for what we've done. But this man, Jesus, in between us, he is innocent." And then that same criminal looks over to Jesus and says, "Please remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus looks back at that criminal hanging on the cross right next to him, and he tells him, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." So talk about a buzzer beater right there. And I don't know if I mentioned before, but I'm part of a morning small group here in Starkville, where I go to a Wednesday morning small group with some people from my church. And the session this week, we talked about this story, and one of the people in the small group had said, you know, just I think he was quoting a preacher that he heard a while back, but he was talking about this criminal who was saved at the very last second that made it to heaven. And other people in heaven asked him, hey, so did you live a righteous life on earth? And he's like, no. And they're like, oh, okay, well, did you give a lot to the church? No, I didn't. Like, oh, well, did you, were you baptized? Does this apply to you? Did you check these boxes? Like, no. And they're like, well, how are you here in heaven? And the man replies, the guy on the middle cross said I could come. So, in no uncertain terms, let Jesus into your heart and become saved. That's your way into heaven. You don't have to worry about all this criteria. And don't get me wrong, still live a righteous life and a good life. But a criminal, a lifelong criminal, probably one of the most unrighteous men in that area, at the last second, he was saved because he gave his heart to Jesus. And Jesus told him, you will see me in paradise. We will be in paradise together. And while this is going on, earlier I mentioned the soldiers had stripped Jesus. The people are down now casting lots to try and figure out who gets what. They're dividing up Jesus's clothes, throwing it out. And they're like, hey, if you're the Messiah, that they said the same thing that the first criminal said, come down and save yourself. What are you doing? If you truly are the Son of God and you have all this power, then get down from that cross. So for 3 hours during this, it's written that the sun stopped shining and that the area was engulfed in darkness and that the curtain of the temple was torn in two. And this is another thing we talked about in our morning small group. So the temple, this is referring to the tabernacle, where the tabernacle inside the main courtyard, there was a tent that had the tent of meeting inside of it. And then inside that, there was a most holy place behind a curtain where the ark was, the golden ark that had the 10 Commandments and Aaron's staff in it, where the golden ark sat. And during Jesus' crucifixion, that curtain was torn because Jesus was going back to his Father. There was no longer that dividing wall. And in the same sense, that dividing wall was torn down also because we see that now Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. You know the verse, no one comes to the Father except through me. So darkness engulfs, the veil is torn, and Jesus looks up and calls out to his Father, and he says, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And Jesus dies. And all this occurring, one of the centurions standing there after witnessing that, he watched all the people mocking Jesus, Jesus refusing to come down from that cross, saving the heart of another person while he was at it, and crying out to his Father. A centurion sees that, and it's written that he remarked, this must be a righteous man. We just killed a righteous man. And from there, we jump to Mark 16, where it's written that, well, first, a man named Joseph, this isn't Joseph, Jesus' father, this is somebody else, a man named Joseph, he took Jesus' body and he wrapped it in cloth and placed it in a tomb. And you know the imagery, a large stone was rolled in front of the doorway into the tomb, and it was sealed. We jump over to the Gospel of Mark in chapter 16, where it reads that after the Sabbath, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, there's a lot of Marys, and someone named Salome, they brought some spices to the tomb to anoint Jesus' body, as was custom at the time. That was the burial rituals. They brought some spices to anoint the body. But when they got there, this is 3 days later, they saw that the stone had been rolled away. They're like, well, obviously that's not supposed to happen. And they walk in, and it's written that a young man dressed in white was sitting inside the tomb, and he told them, "Do not be alarmed. He has risen. Jesus is risen. The tomb is empty. He's risen." Jump back to Matthew 28. I remember I warned y'all there'd be a little bit of hopscotch in here. Some guards overhear this, and they go into the city and they report to the chief priest all that's happened. They're like, hey, the tomb is empty. His body's gone. We have no idea what happened. And the chief priest, they bribe those guards and they say, here's what you're going to do. You're going to tell everyone that Jesus' disciples came in the dead of night and stole his body. And if the governor finds out about this, we will handle it. But the official story, you better go out there and tell everyone that Jesus did not rise back to life. He's not up in heaven. You better go tell everyone that the disciples came and took him in the middle of the night. That's on you. We're gonna give you this bribe. You're gonna go do what we say. Now we move to Luke chapter 24, where two disciples are on the road to a place named Emmaus when Jesus himself approaches them, but during this moment, he prevents them from knowing who he is. He kind of disguises himself. And Jesus is like, hey, what is going on? You know, what all's happening? And the disciples reply, they tell the story, you know, Jesus, he was captured, found guilty, he was crucified, and there was a part in their story when they were like, you know, he was, you know, we're so sad that he's gone because he was supposed to be the savior of us all. And Jesus is obviously, you know, standing there, and he rebukes them. He rebukes that talk, and he essentially gives them a lecture as they continue walking, explaining, actually, read through the laws of Moses, read through all of these prophecies, everything has been fulfilled. And they say, you know, all of those things had to happen. He basically says, you must have little faith to think that Jesus, the Son of God, is actually dead and gone. He's like, let me lay it out for you. So the whole way back to Emmaus on that long road, Jesus lays it out exactly what has unfolded and how it's unfolded. And Jesus he stays with them for a little while, because once the disciples approach a village, they decide to eat. Remember, this is just two disciples. They decide to eat, and as they're eating, Jesus makes it known who he is. He allows them to see who he is and disappears. He's gone. Disappears. And the disciples immediately rush back to Jerusalem, back to the main 11. You know, it was 12. It's 11 now because Judas is done. He's gone. They go back to the 11 and they share the news that Jesus is risen. They get to tell everyone he's alive. He is alive. And Jesus now appears to all the disciples. He appears among them, and it's written that they thought that he was a ghost. They were pretty scared, and in that moment, he even holds up his hands, and he allows one of the disciples to touch his hands and I think actually crucifix. I think it was the wrist actually, but they touch where the nails were in his hand, and they feel that indention where the nails were. And Jesus is basically like, if I was a ghost, would you be able to do that? And he appears back to the disciples, and he gives them this is where he commissions them. He gives them the authority to do good works in his name. They will be able to heal the sick and perform miracles. And as his last act, Jesus reinstates Peter as an apostle, because Peter denied Jesus 3 times before his death, and he is broken and in sorrow, and Jesus reappears, and as his last act, he puts his hand on Peter, forgives him, and reinstates him. And then after Jesus commissions his disciples, they have their orders. Jesus lifts up his hands, and as he lifts up his hands to heaven and to his Father, he's taken up into heaven. And that is the Easter story. In preparation for this episode, rereading a lot of this stuff, it just, the weight of all this, there's so many things that Jesus says that just stick to your heart. They're so profound. The fact how we can relate to the disciples in that moment where, hey, we know that this has to happen, but we don't want it to happen. We want to protect you, Jesus. We don't want to let this happen. And then after Jesus dies, the disciples allowing themselves to believe, maybe he really is gone. Maybe that was it. Then Jesus on the cross, asking his Father to forgive the very people who are nailing his arms and legs to a wooden cross. He asks his Father to forgive them. And in the last second, he saves the soul of a man who's being executed right next to him. And I don't know if there's words to describe how profound and how heavy that story is without just saying it's powerful. And praise God that Jesus is risen and he is living. I hear sometimes a lot of people say when they're talking about Bible, back when Jesus was alive, back when Jesus was on this earth, but not back when he was alive, because Jesus is alive. He was alive yesterday, he's alive today, and he will be alive forever. And there's a phrase that's derived, obviously, from the Easter story that I'm sure y'all have heard before. Friday might be tough, but Sunday's coming. Things might look dark. There might be so much chaos. But just know that there is always good on the other side of every battle that God puts in front of you. There is joy and happiness and love and eternal life behind those struggles if you accept Jesus into your heart. So from my house and my family to yours, happy Easter. And like I said, the Fridays might be tough, but Sunday is coming. This has been Church and State with Spencer Sanderson.